Can there be astrologers who are Christian, Janelle?
Oh gosh. Oh, there have been so many.
Welcome, everyone. Today we are diving into the story of the Magi, also known as the Three Kings. Now, this story is only in the Gospel of Matthew, and Janelle will explain to us it's only a matter of verses, but it is a prominent part of how we celebrate the holiday season. Janelle, I am so excited to dive into this discussion with you and really uncover some truths and some debates that are still going on around the Magi, astrology, and what is the symbolism behind the story of these three kings. So thank you so much for taking time today to teach us a little bit more about what you're learning in your studies.
Of course. Katie, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to have this conversation. Obviously, I've been spending a lot of time diving deep into the Magi over the last several months. And so I can't wait to get started.
So start us off with a little bit of history about the Gospel of Matthew and the story of the Magi.
There is a lot of debate about the history of the Magi. So when it comes to the actual Gospel of Matthew, it was written about 50 years after the death of Christ. By an anonymous author, not by the apostle Matthew, as is commonly thought. But what we do know about him is that he was a Jewish convert to Christianity, okay? And that's really important to note because that's who he was probably speaking to. And so when you think about the fact that the story of the Magi, it's only 12 verses, but it has created this ripple throughout the church where even, I mean, there are so many patristic writings or writings by early church fathers on the Magi, and the story creates so many questions, right? Like, what was the star? Who were the Magi? Why did they bring those three gifts specifically? And then there's the slaughter of the infants, right? Afterwards, and it's this whole to do, right? But it was only included, this narrative was only included in the Gospel of Matthew. It's not featured in the Gospel of Luke. And so you would think if there was so much to do, if it was such a big deal, why wouldn't the author of Luke include it? Additionally, there is no other historical evidence for kind of this mass slaughter of boys under the age of 2 years old. Now, many people don't realize that Bethlehem was a very small town, only 5 miles from Jerusalem. And so that brings up some other questions, again, like specifically regarding the historicity of the story, because if, as we all know, Herod, well, as historians know, Herod was a psychopath. And so the question becomes, if this newborn king of the Jews is only 5 miles away, why wouldn't Herod have the Magi followed? Why wouldn't there be spies in the village, telling Herod, informing Herod of where the newborn king of the Jews was, right? But then also, because it was a small town, there would only be a few, there would probably be like a dozen, right? Boys under the, toddler boys under the age of 2, right? And so people who argue against the historicity of the story say there was no need to slaughter all the boys under the age of 2. They could have just figured out which house it was and known from there and pursued, the Holy Family. Those who argue for the historicity of the story would say, well, it was only a dozen boys who were killed. He was a psychopath. He killed people all the time. Maybe no one felt it worthy to write about, that story. And so the in terms of background, it's kind of hard because we don't actually know if the story was historical, and actually historians and theologians kind of all agree, those who aren't arguing one way or the other. There is a lot of agreement in academic circles basically saying we can't really know for sure, right? Like, this is just kind of one of those things that, because there isn't any additional evidence for the story, we kind of have to lean towards it being legendary. But there are also some pretty specific historical markers in the story that makes it just doesn't read like a legend. It reads more like a historical narrative. So, but in terms of the background, it was written by a Jewish convert to Christianity in the first century, and really, it was important enough that the author chose to include it in a gospel that
Mhm.
we believe was primarily written for Jewish converts to Christianity. And so I think that there's a lot there we can dive into.
Yeah, definitely. Based on your research, what has been the debate around if the Magi did exist? Were they astrologers or not?
Yeah. So, really, at the end of the day, that debate is happening amongst people who are not historians or theologians. So, that's the debate that's happening among the laity or among even the members of a religious order who are against, who use the story as an apologetics against divination or astrology or alternative spirituality, right? And so there are some, priests who will say, that it's a representation of them leaving their tools of evil, leaving their old ways behind, and then going home another way, right? Like it says in the narrative. And they say that, well, the star didn't lead them to Christ, it led them to Herod, who then enacted this, terribly evil act. And that's what, astrology leads to, right?
Mhm.
Of course, what that does is that takes a literal reading of the story and assumes that it's historical, which again, a lot of academics don't. But what it also does is it adds a lot to the narrative that
Yeah.
simply isn't there. And Raymond Brown, who wrote The Birth of the Messiah, his opinion, I mean, he says it plain and clear. He's like, that is an apologetics argument against alternative spirituality, not true biblical exegesis of Matthew. So
Mhm.
basically he's saying like, that is you trying to use the Gospel of Matthew to support your opinion, but that's
Mhm.
not a true academic reading of Matthew. And I would definitely agree. And so that argument is happening again among the laity, but in academic circles, it's not an argument actually. Like academics, theologians, and historians agree that if the Magi existed, and even if they didn't, it is pretty clear that they are being portrayed in the story as astrologers, either historical or fictional.
I think that's impactful. Like let's stop and take that in, that those who are studying this are going, yeah, it's pretty clear.
Pretty clear. Yep.
But those who have studied and then are going and teaching the masses are going, beware. Not all of them, but
Um,
beware.
yeah.
This,
Um,
there's a piece to this that it's like, whoa, okay. So it's beautiful you're bringing this to light for us
mhm.
to better understand, and even for us to do our own research, right? Like to read these books. I love that you're telling us like read this book. Look at this. This is really helpful.
Yeah.
Um, what are the truths we know about the Magi from what is written in Scripture, and also what people have tried to find historically? Like you said, there's not really clear yes they really exist or not. So what have we found to be true?
Yeah, I mean, if you actually read the narrative, right? Like if you read the story and, don't think about what's been added to it, because you have to think there is so much that has been added. Like, they'll show one being Asian, one being African, one being Caucasian, right? Like doesn't say that in there. They
Right.
were probably Middle Eastern, right? And just, all kinds of things are added to the story. They weren't at the nativity scene despite, us placing them there. And so removing kind of the pop culture from it, if you read the narrative, it's Magi from the East, right? And so the term Magi, it does insinuate kind of this uh, Persian Persian origin, and really it's members of what their priestly caste. So, and that's exactly what Benedict XVI says. He's a systematic theologian as well as our former pope, and he basically breaks it down by by the different elements of the story. And the fact that they were magi means that they probably came from Persia and that they were kind of these magicians. They had this sort of esoteric knowledge, okay? As we can tell, because they chose to make this, long and arduous journey, searching in search of a newborn king, and brought these, very expensive, valuable, beautiful gifts to the Christ child. And so, what we also can tell from the story is that they were spiritual seekers, right? They clearly were not aware. They clearly were not Jewish. They were definitely Gentiles because they came in the newborn king of the Jews, right? Which the Jews would not have called it the child, right? They would have called him the
Yeah.
Messiah, right? And so they kind of come in and they come to Jerusalem and they're looking for this king and there's this sort of confusion, right? Like the scribes were amazed, right? Like the whole city was amazed of like, what are you looking for? Who? Where? And so they kind of caused this flurry in Jerusalem, right? And so, you have to go to the Jewish scribes who knew scripture and they were able to tell the Magi, well, if it's the Messiah, he's supposed to be born in Bethlehem, which was 5 miles away from Jerusalem, right? And so they go and they find the child and his mother and they lay down their gifts and they do him homage. So these are clearly people who know God when they see him,
Hmm.
right? And I think that is an incredibly important aspect of the story, right? As they lay down their gifts, they offer them to the Christ child, and they worshipped him, right? And so I think it's important to note that they were clearly seeking
Hmm.
spiritual seekers. They were clearly knowledgeable, and they knew enough about the land of Judea to know where the capital was and where to go, but they didn't know enough about, the Jewish legends and the Jewish prophecies to know to go to Bethlehem, right? And so we're talking about this very difficult to pin down, right? It's a character that is, they're simply seekers, right? And I think that Matthew, and some theologians agree with this, it kind of seems like Matthew was intentionally being vague, right? Because the fact of the matter is that the Gentiles, or excuse me, the Magi could be any of us, right? Like we're seeking, we're kind of confused. We have some lights in the dark, right? We have some indication of who God might be or where he might be. We
Hmm.
kind of know where to go to find him, but at the end of the day, I mean, this is probably getting ahead of ourselves, but what we know is that they were wealthy, well educated,
Hmm.
very spiritual men who were seeking the Christ child. And I think there's a reason why that story has kind of reverberated across time, right?
Yeah, definitely. Well, the elephant in the room is always about the star,
Mhm.
right? The three
It
kings,
is,
and they were following the star, and astrologers or not, there was the star.
right?
And we see it in nativity scenes. And here in Europe, it's always like there's a big star right next to the nativity. And I'm just wondering about this star because clearly scientifically it cannot be a star that bright and that close to Earth. So what do we know to be true about the star and what are these historians and things really discovering about that part of the story?
Right. So early church fathers believed it was an actual star because they did not know what stars actually were. They didn't realize they were these huge balls of gas, millions of light years away, right? And so going with all of the different theories that modern theologians and historians have, there's basically four. So it could be a supernova, it could be Halley's Comet or another comet. It
Mhm.
could be an astrological conjunction or phenomenon, or it could be some other sort of miraculous event like an angel or just a earth-sized star that God chose to put above the stable that kind of led them where they needed to go. So again, there are lots of theories. There are a couple of theologians who argue that it was like an angel or something of that sort. It's what's difficult about that is that unlike in the Gospel of Luke, where it kind of shows the angel guiding the shepherds, and the angel rather appearing to the shepherds, informing them of what had happened, and guiding them to the stable where the child lay. Right? We have some context in that story. Again, Matthew is a little bit more vague. And so we don't know what happened, what was the origin story there? Like, why did the Magi choose to leave? And there isn't that background in the narrative to say an angel spoke to the Magi and led them to Jerusalem. It also begs the question of why would a miraculous event lead them to Jerusalem and not to Bethlehem? Some would argue that it was because, number one, the birth of the Messiah had to be announced according to some prophecies. What people who argue for that theory would say is that because this was a Jewish author speaking to a Jewish population, that maybe it was also kind of an apologetical argument saying this is how we know this is the Messiah because see, all of these prophecies are fulfilled, right?
Mhm.
And so, but then that begs the question of did the author of Matthew invent a story that fulfills all of these prophecies? Because that wouldn't be like very, that would be difficult to reconcile, right? So then that means the story must be historical. So you can see how like that theory just it kind of snowballs into a bunch of other questions that a lot of theologians and historians think is an overcomplication of the narrative and kind of lends itself to again this like rabbit trail of things that just can never be known, right?
Yeah.
And so that theory is kind of difficult to reconcile, this like magical, miraculous thing um, that, kind of led them away from the path. And also, it just doesn't say, like, the gospel doesn't say that it was miraculous. It says that it was a star, and a star is a real live thing, right? And so it's reading in between the lines, which we don't like to do, especially when there is no other historical evidence. You don't want to we don't want to read ourselves and our worldview into a narrative, right?
Right.
And so that's very hard to do. So we have to, if you're going by what the narrative actually says, it wasn't miraculous. It was a celestial phenomenon and specifically a star. Okay, so we can set that theory aside. So now we can go to a supernova. There were no supernovas recorded around, even in like the 20, 30-year period around when Christ was born, because that would have been recorded in particular by the Chinese. They were watching the sky, kept
Mhm.
impeccable records, nothing was recorded. So, we can set that theory aside. Okay, so that leaves us with a comet, and that leaves us with an astrological phenomenon. Halley's Comet did go over Jerusalem in 12 BCE. Okay,
Okay.
so it's close enough to when we think Christ was born. Current historians put Christ's birth around 6 or 7 BCE, and even as early as 4 BCE. And so it's certainly within range, right? The problem with the comet theory is that comets tend to herald doom and gloom in terms
Mhm.
of its interpretation. Again, not a newborn king necessarily. And so there's that. The other piece of that too is that there, in terms of other historical markers of Jesus's life, 12 BCE is a little bit too early, like it doesn't quite match up. And wherever the Magi were coming from, it probably wouldn't have taken them 5 or 6 years to get to Christ.
Right.
And so that theory, while some choose to stick to it, is also not the most viable theory. So, and that
Mhm.
leaves us with an astrological conjunction, right? With Jupiter, which is the planet of kings, and
Mhm.
Saturn were conjunct in the sign of Pisces, which is the sign of God. And they were conjunct 3 times between 6 and 7 BCE. Like they kept going retrograde and they kept finding each other. Those
Mhm.
are planets that are visible to the naked eye, and when they are conjunct, they look like one big star. And the Magi, again, being these sort of magicians, like it just checks
Mhm.
all the boxes. It's the right time, right? It's the right place. The interpretation is there, and again, and I talk about this in the video, like there are intrinsic likelihoods, right? And so if the Magi were astrologers, it's intrinsically likely that they were using astrology, right? And so yeah, that is really it in terms of what's actually in the narrative. it is most likely
Hmm.
that the star was the astrological conjunction and the astronomical conjunction of
Hmm.
Jupiter and Saturn in the sign of Pisces.
Yeah. So for those who are listening and are like, oh, the word astrologer, and no, and this seems bad, can there be astrologers who are Christian, Janelle?
Oh gosh. Oh, there have been so many.
Right? I was like, it's biblically there, but also, is that
Yes,
possible? Because I think for many, they have been taught to believe that it's not possible.
I know. And that is such a tragedy, Katie. It really is. Yes, Christians can be astrologers, believe it or not. Um, for my part, I'm a Catholic theologian, and so we go by the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It's this fun book. It has all of our doctrines. There's only one article in the Catechism about astrology, and it basically says we're not supposed to use astrology or any tool that encourages us to attempt to predict the future,
Right.
right? So predictive astrology is off the table. Otherwise,
Yeah.
we're pretty much good to go. I mean, the Vatican doesn't have no modern Vatican documents discuss astrology, unless they're talking about the Magi and it's in a
Right.
positive light, right? It's hard to believe because it's spoken about so poorly, right? Like among the laity, and on the internet. But all of the so to be fair, when apologists are discussing the negative aspects of astrology, they typically will quote early church fathers. Okay, and
Hmm.
the early church fathers, and I explain all of this in my presentation as well. The early church fathers lived in a time where astrology was utilized heavily in pagan religions and pagan rituals. And back then, the way that astrology was practiced was it was called deterministic astrology, which basically said you're born under the stars, and whatever chart you were born under, that is your fate, right?
Hmm.
So you think about even today we can think back if anyone's seen the movie Hercules, right? There were the three goddesses that they
Yep.
were the fate, right? And they had one eyeball and they'd share it between the three of them,
Yep.
right? And when it was someone's time, they would cut the string of their
Yep.
life, right? And that was their fate, right? They were fated to die at that moment. Christians coming on the scene, and again, this originates in Judaism. So Judaism coming on the scene, being a monotheistic religion, number one, I mean, that already is very countercultural, right? But also having this concept of free will.
Yeah.
We are that anyone, Greek or Jew, free or slave, man or woman, that we have free will. That was a brand new concept. And so in particular, when we're thinking about, the Greek, the paganism that was heavily influenced by Hellenistic culture, which believed in fate and believed in the will of the gods, kind of determined your lives and whether or not they were pleased with you. That was very contrary to what the early Christian church was teaching and believed. And so the early church fathers and their arguments against astrology were arguing against that idea of fate.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Mhm.
If we dive into going back to the Magi in this story, and if it is a fictitious story,
Mhm.
let's look into the symbolism of it. Who are these Magi then? And then really what does that star represent?
Right, right. Yeah, so I mean that's like that begs the question, right? Like if it is fiction, why would Matthew include it, right? Why
Yeah,
would it be
absolutely.
included in the narrative? And so there are a couple of theories around that. Um, one of them is to encourage the Jewish converts to Christianity to accept the Gentile converts.
Hmm.
So there was some debate in that time about whether or not the Messiah was only for the chosen people.
Okay.
The author of Matthew was clearly very invested in communicating that no, Christ came for to save the whole world, right? He ends the gospel with go and make disciples of all the nations, right? So clearly that was a quote, by Christ. And so clearly that was an important message that the author of Matthew wanted to include, that no, Christ came for the whole world. And I'm going to illustrate that for you by this legend. Perhaps we think it was to communicate that Christ came for the whole world. We think that another potential purpose for including the story is as an example for the Gentiles, right? And just this recognition of your culture, your history, your practices, they will get you close, right?
Mm,
Maybe they'll get you 99% of the way there, right? But they won't get you all the way. And just this recognition of, as Gentiles converting, we do have to be willing to learn from the Jewish scribes. We do have to be willing to recognize the wisdom that is included in the Old Testament. And that is what gets us all the way to Christ, right? And so just that recognition of these were wise men, and there's no indication otherwise. These were wise men, but they had to go to the Jewish scribes to get the full story, right? And be led to Christ. And so, I think as far as sort of the reasoning behind legends go, those are the two things, the 2 points that we can probably ascertain for sure. It also seems, I would add a third point to that actually. It would also seem that he was trying to place the birth of Christ in history, because he said, in Bethlehem of Judea, there was another Bethlehem. And so he was stating which Bethlehem Christ was born during the reign of Herod. So the place and the
yeah.
time frame of Christ's birth. And that is actually really why a lot of theologians can't give up the idea of it being historical altogether, because they're like, he said the place and the time. Like legends don't, right? Like legends begin once upon a time, right? They don't begin with like here and at this moment, right? So it feels historical, but if it was a legend, it might have been part of it was to place the birth of Christ in chronological history as well.
Mhm. I really appreciate the idea of the story being a representation of how we all need each other,
Yeah.
right? You need both sides, especially historically during that time. You needed to accept both sides
Yeah.
and the beauty of that. Now, you kind of alluded to something earlier about how interesting it was that they were wealthy and wise. So share with us a little bit about what that was. Kind of you piqued my interest. What was it that comes up for you?
Well, sure. I mean, the implications for what we call in theology ecumenism, which is kind of that conversation between people of different religions, the implication of this story for ecumenism is huge. And that really is where theologians tend to go, um, because it shows, I don't think it's a coincidence that in the Gospel of Matthew, we have Gentiles coming to worship Christ. And in the Gospel of Luke, we have Jewish shepherds coming to worship Christ. And the Jewish shepherds came through an angel because that was their way. And the Gentiles came through astrology because that was their way. And it's this recognition of multiple paths to Christ, right?
Mhm.
And so I think that that is so beautiful. Um, they were wealthy and they were wise. I think that Matthew is really emphasizing here that there is nothing to be demeaned about the wise men, about the Magi. That they were not people to scoff at. They were not people coming out of sorrow. They were not being coerced. Actually, completely the opposite. They willingly undertook a long and arduous and expensive and potentially dangerous journey to come to the Christ child out of their own desire, right? And so there's no coercion, there's no guilt tripping, there is no fire and brimstone, right? It was um, this recognition that all creation leads us to Christ, right? Leads to it sings the praises of its creator, right? Which I think is such a beautiful thought.
And I always love the juxtaposition of you have these wealthy, wise people and this baby that was born in a stable, right? It's like there's no place for you. You're going to be here. And of course, they saw him later when he was a little bit older as a toddler, but still that like opposites still
Mhm.
can come together. I
Absolutely.
have enjoyed this conversation, I feel like I've thought of so millions of questions, but I would love for people to write in the comments below what their questions are, so they can have a conversation with you around some of the nuances and maybe even book recommendations you have, and if you can put that in the description too, the ones you've already referenced to, but also ones that might be helpful as people go on this journey to learn more. Nobody's saying throw away your three kings from your nativity scene or
No,
get rid
no,
of
I
that.
love the three kings.
No,
Yeah.
exactly. But to be able to really appreciate the symbolism of them and really what they represent in the book, in the Gospel of Matthew, I think is really powerful. So I'm grateful for your wisdom and the things you're sharing with us as you do this research, as you write on it, as you do videos and presentations on it. I know it will really open people's eyes to going a little bit deeper into reading the Bible, reading the books around the Bible and things, and to have their own journey instead of just reading and assuming, studying it.
Correct. Yes. Katie, thank you so much for this conversation. I absolutely leave any comments below, any questions that you have. I would love to clarify, and I'll also leave some sources down below so that people can read.